Over the course of the roughly 14 billion years that our universe has existed, the story of cosmic evolution has been a consistent motion toward ever greater states of complexity and novelty. Innumerable forms have come and gone, yet novel developments remain. As we look deeper into the past, time itself acts like a kind of eraser, and the further back we go, fragments of primordial life become increasingly further apart. It thus appears then that time is accelerating, spiraling towards a future of boundless potentiality. As if awakening from a long, dreamless sleep, the dawn of man was the moment in which evolution began to unfold upon itself. A being that possesses the ability to turn inward and self-reflect upon itself, not only to know, but to know that it knows, is a transformation of such immensity and consequence that in a flash results in the birth of an entirely new reality. Reason, logic, abstraction, imagination, and emotion, seen throughout human history in cave paintings, mythologies, symphonies, scientific theories, and philosophical frameworks, are products of what might be called involution, that is, consciousness evolution. This video essay will explore the spirituality of human evolution, from the formation of the Earth to the first life forms to the explosion of biological diversity all the way to modernity. We will come to see that this is not simply the result of random chance in a blind, purposeless process. One of the central ideas is that humankind is indeed something remarkably strange, profound, and meaningful. We are living in a deep mystery. A mystery full of fractals and metaphors, and in which a vast cosmic drama is unfolding with the passing of each moment within our own lives. Towards the second half of this video, we will touch on themes ranging from what the near and deep future of consciousness evolution may hold for humanity, some thoughts on the various pitfalls of the techno-capitalist dystopia currently in the works, and how we might continue to develop a more integral and holistic worldview in light of it all. This is a journey which we could not do on our own, of course, and with that, we'll introduce the thinker whose works will guide us along these winding paths. Within his magnum opus, The Phenomenon of Man, the 20th century French paleontologist and cosmologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin outlines a sweeping view of the evolution of the universe, Earth, and humankind. Written during the 1930s, the book is at once scientific, metaphysical, and poetic, and in it, Chardin describes the whole of evolution as a process of complexification. The universe is fundamentally driven by a creative impulse to increase consciousness through biological forms. He came to the conclusion that the evolutionary tree of life was a process that, from the beginning, was ultimately aimed toward the creation of the human being. Recognizing this intensification of consciousness on Earth, he predicted this trend ultimately to lead to the world being encompassed in consciousness, and that this would lead to a grand synthesis in the deep future, an ultimate unification of all consciousness and matter, which he termed the Omega Point. If one were to summarize the entirety of Chardin's thought into one word, it would be complexity. Chardin's ideas were immensely controversial in his time among academic scientists and theologians, with his Jesuit superiors repeatedly restricting his publications and postings. Later on in 1962, 7 years after his death, the Holy Office issued an official decree warning the public about his ideas. Your thesis is exciting and interesting to a high degree. It is a rich canvas, full of beautiful images, but it is not at all suited for our peaceful readers. Likewise, he had openly rejected the idea of original sin, something else which landed him in hot water with the church. As a result, Teilhard de Chardin was effectively exiled from France and spent many years doing archaeological research in China. As a result of being denied publishing rights, he would remain relatively unknown to the public throughout his life, and The Phenomenon of Man wouldn't be published until after his death in 1955. The book would then be translated to English with a foreword written by Julian Huxley, brother of the philosopher and novelist Aldous Huxley, whose exposition of the perennial philosophy we explored in the previous video. Julian Huxley was a prominent evolutionary biologist and one of the leading proponents of what would come to be called Neo-Darwinism. While he differed from Teilhard de Chardin's mystical and religious inclinations, Huxley stood largely in support of the narrative of the phenomenon of man. Chardin's thought is one flavored with Christian mysticism and German idealism. It rejects the idea of the universe as being simply a blind, mechanistic, purposeless machine. Being influenced early on in his career upon reading the recently published Creative Evolution, written by the philosopher Henri Bergson, he would write, "The only effect that brilliant book had upon me was to provide fuel at just the right moment, and very briefly, for a fire that was already consuming my heart and mind." In this book, Bergson articulates an understanding of the evolution of life that radically diverges from the Darwinian theory of natural selection. While Bergson accepted the basic idea that things evolve, he rejected purely mechanistic explanations. Instead, Bergson saw evolution to be guided by what he called the élan vital, a vital impetus, which was a kind of inner drive or creative impulse that pushes matter toward ever greater states of complexity, freedom, and consciousness. Yet within Chardin's works, we find a man who is possessed with burning questions from both realms of existence. On the one hand, he was a paleontologist and a man of science, making many significant contributions to the field, including the discovery of the famous pecking man hominid fossil. He was a naturalist as well, with a deeply romantic fascination for the natural world, especially for the world of minerals. On the other hand was his sense of spirituality and religiosity, being ordained as a priest by the Jesuits at age 30 after many years of theological study and ascetic practices. Over the years, Chardin would come to see the schism emerging between the new reality that modern science was uncovering through the fields of evolutionary biology, and he sought to reconcile this new picture of the world with his deep religious conviction within the Christian faith. This newly emerging picture of human natural history through the compounding of paleontological and anthropological evidence was something Chardin could not ignore. But neither could he ignore the picture of humanity as divinely placed in a created world. Both visions seem to demand an answer to the same underlying question. What meaning can be found in the great narrative of the human journey? And to what end is this story ultimately aimed? Chardin's worldview was influenced early on during his experiences in the First World War. Serving as a stretcher bearer for the 8th Moroccan Rifles in 1917, Chardin would continue to write and develop his reflections during the intense experiences in the trenches, describing the war as a, quote, meeting with the absolute. Throughout this time, he would conceptualize many of the ideas that would come to flourish later in his life. In a letter he wrote while on the front lines, he speculates on the future with the phrase, nostalgia for the front. The future cannot but attract us because it is the extreme boundary between what one is already aware of and what is still in process of formation. Likewise, here he intuited for the first time the emerging evolution of a collective human consciousness, which he originally called the Great Monad. We'll explore that in much more depth later on in the video. Central to the cosmology of Teilhard de Chardin is the phenomenon of love. For Chardin, love is not simply a biochemical reaction in an organism's brain, nor is it merely an evolutionary driver which only serves to ensure the survival of species. Love is in fact a cosmic principle, a fundamental force of the universe which is the drive toward unity, the affinity for being to unite with being, to create a synthesis which is more than the sum of its parts. As we will soon dive deeper into Chardin's interpretation of the evolution of the early universe, it's important to keep in mind that he sought to interpret cosmic evolution with love, consciousness, and imagination as deeply real cosmic principles. In the years following the war, Chardin would continue to hone his intellectual and spiritual career, attending the University of Paris, where he would pursue degrees in geology, botany, and zoology. In 1919, he composed one of his most pivotal essays, The Spiritual Power of Matter, marking the birth of his evolutionary spirituality. Profoundly shaken by the brutality of war and the seemingly industrialized slaughter of his fellow human beings, Chardin struggled to reconcile the cruelty of matter with his sense of spirit. Rather than rejecting the material world as fallen, rather than seeing spirit in opposition to matter, Chardin came to the realization that matter is moving toward spirit, that there is in fact a spiritual movement within matter itself. For Teilhard, this cosmic process would be called Cosmogenesis. Beginning his investigation with pre-biological matter, he explains how the early universe consisted of a very large number of very simple material elements. He first describes the plurality of matter. Once we probe deep enough into anything, at smaller and smaller scales, it reveals itself as more finely granulated. Familiar properties like light, color, and warmth lose their meaning, and we find our sensory experience to be a floating condensation on a swarm of the undefinable. Having the qualities of both uniformity and multiplicity, every single proton, electron, and neutron is identical and behaves like every other proton, electron, and neutron. Chardin would call this the unity of matter. As far back as we can go, and the more we split and pulverize into matter, the more the universe appears to insist on its fundamental unity. But Teilhard stresses that there is indeed something more to primitive matter than merely the swarming soup of inanimate particulates that modern physics describes. Something else must have been latent, present since the very beginning. Within the phenomenon of man, Chardin spends many pages fleshing out the idea that the stuff of the universe has both an external and internal nature, what he refers to as the within and without of things. Because it contains and engenders consciousness, space-time is necessarily of a convergent nature. The central idea that Teilhard puts forth is that everything in the universe has an inner aspect that parallels the exterior complexity of it, and that these interior and exterior aspects are deeply interwoven. For us human beings, we have the most intimate awareness of this. Our without, our bodies and the world around us, is experienced through our within, our self-reflective consciousness, necessarily so. Most would agree that animals have an interior experience, though perhaps not as lucid as ours, and still many believe that plants have an interior experience as well. As we go further down the spiral of time and complexity, we land at the most fundamental building blocks of the universe. The primordial universe that Chardin describes is a universe where each particle has its own within and without, corresponding point by point, and that consciousness is thus an all-pervasive property of the cosmos. Chardin's cosmology also strongly resonates with the theoretical physicist David Bohm's concept of the implicate and explicate orders of reality. Developed in the 1980s, Bohm's concept involves two separate domains of reality. The explicate order is the universe we perceive with the senses, the universe of cause and effect which follows the laws of physics. Conversely, the implicate order is a level of reality which is imperceptible to us, where every single part of the universe contains enfolded within it the entire universe. Bohm's work certainly gave new life to William Blake's notion of to see the world in a grain of sand. They are psychic centers, infinitesimal psychic centers of the universe. In other words, consciousness is a universal molecular property. So what he's saying isn't exactly panpsychism, mind smeared evenly across reality. For Teilhard, interiority intensifies with complexity. Matter and mind are two faces of one process, not two separate substances. With the formation of the early Earth, these unimaginably prolonged and intense processes, volcanic fire, electric storms, cosmic radiation, led to increasingly complex molecular chains like carbon lattices, amino acids, and long, spiraling polymers. Chardin then describes how this eventually resulted in the crystallizing of the world, the emergence of the mineral species. Prior to the organic species, the Earth was a world of crystalline geometries slowly cooling and stabilizing in the silence of deep time. The immense energy released from this synthesis gradually led to more novel and complex molecules, carbonates, hydrates, and nitrates, ushering in the world of polymerization, the organic compounds, the world in which the future of humanity was latent. Over a period spanning some 3.5 billion years, the geosphere grew warm with life. In a process now known to science as abiogenesis, for the first time on Earth, life arose out of non-living matter. What was forming was an entirely new sphere, the biosphere, and Teilhard would call this a planetary change of state. The transition from single to multicellular life would occupy roughly half of this time, some 2 billion years. From this point onwards, we would see an exponential acceleration of life on the planet following the Cambrian explosion roughly 540 million years ago. In a geological instant, life diversified into a kaleidoscope of forms. In the preceding age could be found some of the strangest of forms, Anomalocaris, Opabinia, and Hallucigenia, creatures which seem truly alien to anything alive today. Gelatinous, soft tissue, and bioluminescent jellyfish like ctenophores and cnidarians lived before this time, and likewise proliferated in diversity following the Cambrian. As the tempo quickened, for reasons still debated by science, there emerged the trilobites, early mollusks, and the first chordates like Pikaia, which laid the groundwork for nearly all major animal body plans. Centralized nervous systems, brains, and eyes began emerging in separate branches of life, all moving toward greater interiority. The Earth had achieved a sufficient level of complexity, a critical mass, for something entirely other to thus spontaneously emerge. Cosmogenesis is a dialectical unfolding, an immense drama in which the universe reveals itself to itself. Richard Tarnas. As the newly formed biosphere would continue to proliferate ever more unique kinds of forms in the animal and vegetable kingdom over the course of hundreds of millions of years, something, somewhere, which was entirely other, seems to have been gestating within the evolution of mammals. Mammalian life distinguished itself from the reptilians and amphibians with its warm-blooded vitality. Likewise, the development of mammary glands for nursing their young allowed more time for brains to develop and social bonds to strengthen. Teilhard understood this to represent a deepening of the within, where a gradual centralizing movement toward increased memory and emotion was prefiguring the conditions for another inward change of state. Continuing his investigation of the ever-increasing complexity of natural evolution, Chardin observed how the evolutionary tree of life throughout the history of the planet has consistently been a prolific branching out, and within nearly all biological groups, we find a common pattern of divergence and diversification. A textbook example of this is Darwin's finches, a group of roughly 18 species of passerine birds which all stem from a common ancestor that is believed to have arrived on the Galapagos Islands roughly 1 million years ago. As they spread out over the islands, they diversified into a wide range of separate species, all of which were specialized to the varying ecological conditions across the islands. Within nearly every lineage, we find life exploring possibilities in all directions. Chardin would describe this as the rising of consciousness in evolution, feeling and grasping forward in a space of possibilities, where new forms are sketched out in the heart of neighboring forms. The number of branches upon branches upon branches on this tree of life is truly inconceivable, with each lineage spiraling endlessly in a seemingly relentless attempt at bringing everything into organic form. Each lineage fans outward, seeking adaptive advantage in specialization and form. But with the journey of hominid evolution, we see a radical break from this trend. Rather than a fanning out of increasingly specialized and varied forms, hominid evolution instead seems to have converged on a single form. Bipedal locomotion freed up our hands. Grasping hands are extremely generalized and capable of a wide range of tasks. Unlike fins, wings, claws, or hooves, which are extremely specialized for swimming, flying, burrowing, or running, our appendages have avoided the imprisonment of specialization and can be used for things ranging from comforting a loved one, crafting tools, typing on a keyboard, or punching with balled fists. We externalized our tools. Our forward-facing eyes allowed us to focus on the things we grasp, perhaps the very first foreshadowing of the separation of subject and object. All of these physiological developments throughout this journey, combined with continuing increases in brain size and density, predisposed us to more complex social organization, language, and tool use. Of critical importance to this branch of life is a phenomenon known as neoteny. This is the tendency for a developing organism to retain juvenile characteristics for longer periods of time following birth. Animals that are afforded more time to reach embryological and physiological maturity are given more neural plasticity, and thus have a greater chance of developing more complex brains and social behavior. Species with a very quick birth and maturation process, effectively having to fend for themselves immediately upon exiting the womb, are forced to rely more on instincts and behaviors that have proven effective in the past, and as a consequence lack the psychological complexity that is found in humans. This process of becoming human is what Chardin called hominization. He used this term not only to describe the apparent evolutionary lure of the human form, but also the process by which the animalistic forces of nature are spiritualized through human civilization. Raw and instinctual forces like hunger, sex, aggression, competition, and survival become sublimated with the rise of humanity and transmuted into higher and more potent forms of expression. The competitive struggle of the natural world becomes the economic, political, artistic, and spiritual struggle of the human world. Hominization includes the transition from animal instinct to human thought. And for the process of increasingly more complex brains, he would give the term centrogenesis. This was the phenomenon of our centers of consciousness becoming deeper and more complex. Beginning with the most dimly lit forms of instinctual awareness, the phyletic tree of the hominid family would thus appear to grow warm with consciousness towards the summit. And at the peak of this summit, we find the only remaining hominid species, Homo sapiens. The birth of reflective thought is the emergence of a new order of complexity in life on Earth. Because we have this ability, we are not only different from the rest of the animal world, but quite other. This is not to say that animals aren't conscious either. They certainly might be. But if they knew that they knew, surely the effects of their conscious agency would be more apparent. This is also not to say that humanity is separate from nature. Reflective thought is rather the means by which natural evolution began to consciously redirect itself. It strengthens an organism by giving it a kind of inner lining or interior framework. Because we can reflect, we can plan, calculate, create, ruminate, and so much more. And thus we see across the globe, for better or worse, the dominance of the thinking beings. We have only just cast off the last moorings that held us to the Neolithic age. Chardin did not regard evolution as a blind, purposeless process of chance and probability, but rather as a feeling forward of life's own creative, innate potential. Evolution is the ascent of consciousness veiled in morphology. For Chardin, this story is by no means complete, and he saw this intensification of consciousness to continue its novel and creative advance beyond the world of biology and into the world of mind. Quote, "To write the true natural history of the world, we should need to be able to follow it from within. It would thus no longer appear as an interlocking succession of structural types replacing one another, but as an ascension of inner sap spreading out in a forest of consolidated instincts. Right at its base, the living world is constituted by consciousness clothed in flesh and bone. From the biosphere to the species is nothing but an immense ramification of psychism seeking for itself through different forms. That is where Ariadne's thread leads us if we follow it to the end." Teilhard de Chardin was immensely ambitious in his quest to understand the universe, from the deepest recesses of the past to the furthest reaches of the future. His vision of the future foretells of an Earth becoming completely enveloped with consciousness. Looking at the evolutionary history of the Earth, with the biosphere emerging out of the geosphere and creating a new layer made of biological life, he would go on to say that the continuing progression of culture, language, and technology would eventually give rise to a thinking layer. Growing out of the biosphere, Chardin envisioned a cosmic, noetic sphere that was made of human thought. The Psychozoic era, marked not by the blue of the seas or the green of the forests, but of the phosphorescence of thought. What Chardin saw in humanity across the world was a shimmering dust of individualities slowly becoming more collective by nature through a process that he called Noegenesis. The tiny fragments of individual centers of consciousness are gradually coalescing into a kind of planetary consciousness. Just like how the billions of neurons firing in our own brains constitute the activity of our minds and perpetuate our sense of selfhood, the billions of human cells on Earth are multiplying, coalescing, and collectivizing so as to give way to an emergent property on a cosmic scale, by forming what he called the noosphere. Deriving from the Aristotelian concept of the nous, which means something along the lines of mind or divine intellect, and a play on the term biosphere, the noosphere is perhaps one of Teilhard's most prophetic visions of the future. The term itself was developed in the early 20th century by Edouard Leroy and Vladimir Vernadsky alongside Teilhard, and Teilhard then gave it its unmistakably spiritual arc. The noosphere isn't a material sphere in the same way that the biosphere is. Rather, it is made of mind, signifying a spiritual change of state from planetary life to planetary consciousness. It includes the products and effects of modern technologies, but also goes beyond it. So if the geosphere is made of geological substance and the biosphere is made of living substance, then the noosphere is made of thinking substance. For Chardin, human society was no more than the higher mechanics of biology, and biology was no more than the physics of very large complexes. As humanity has evolved and complexified over the past few thousand years, going from bands of foragers to villages, towns, cities, nation-states, and now a truly planetary web, social complexity has always risen alongside communication technology. Language, writing, print, telegraph, radio, and the modern internet. Each step interlinks minds together into faster feedback loops, like axons in a planetary nervous system. Seen in this light, the internet is less an accident and more a visible scaffolding for Chardin's noosphere. Indeed, he believed that hypothesizing the noosphere would be necessary to account for the special forces released by the psychic phenomenon of hominization. We can think of the noosphere as being similar to the Akashic records or the Jungian collective unconscious. It is the sum total of all human knowledge and thought, where all human experience is gathered and consolidated. Teilhard makes it clear that this collective consciousness doesn't entail a loss of individual personality. It doesn't mean that all uniqueness will be absorbed into a homogeneous totality. Instead, the noosphere requires a maximum expression of each individual personality in order for the ephemeral dust of separate personalities to coalesce so as to complete one another. His morality is thus a morality which prioritizes the growth of personality and consciousness. If it limits or restricts the expression or growth of personality, freedom, or consciousness, then it is morally unjust. Furthermore, the idea that within the noosphere everything is saved and preserved eternally is also in agreement with the philosopher and cultural historian Jean Gebser's notion of consciousness structures, as described in The Ever-Present Origin. In his framework, each consciousness structure builds upon the previous one, making the older ones never lost but rather operating in the deeper strata of the collective unconscious. In the roughly 6 decades since the very first sparks of the internet came online, our planet has rapidly become enveloped by a dense layer of unseen, interconnected networks. Throughout this time, media theorists like Marshall McLuhan, with his concept of the global village, as well as cultural analysts and philosophers like the systems theorist and cyberneticist Gregory Bateson, with his idea of an ecology of mind, have tried to understand what role the internet and digital communication networks have in the long arc of human and biological evolution. Is the internet simply a strange artificial epiphenomenon? Or could it be just as natural a process evolutionarily as the emergence of multicellular life from the primordial soup, or of the emergence of civilization from primitive hominid species? Writing long before the advent of the internet and social media, Chardin effectively predicted the internet, or at least something very much like it. Evidently, the 1990s would give Chardin's writings a renewed boost of popularity. With connections to the world of New Age spirituality, cybernetics, deep ecology, and more, it's no wonder that Terence McKenna was a fan of Teilhard. Indeed, so many thinkers have been influenced by him and built upon his ideas that we couldn't possibly list them all. In the present phase of modern techno-capitalism, new generations of human beings are being born into a world with a global, digital sphere running parallel to it. And so we might be led to think that Chardin's vision of the Noosphere would thus appear to be in full bloom. However, his potentially overly optimistic version of the flourishing of personal diversities coalescing into a collective unity seems to be as yet unrealized. This is why I personally believe that the internet is not the Noosphere, but rather a kind of primitive scaffolding upon which our own collective consciousness can grow like a vine, to create the actual interlinking of minds within this planetary brain. Each individual today has a digital self, which is extended into this primitive noosphere. For instance, I can upload past moments and fragments of myself that can be accessed, if I wish, by anyone anywhere at any time, making parts of my own sentience, in a sense, non-local and atemporal. Further complicating the matter is that now anyone can artificially replicate anyone's likeness with only a single photo or audio clip. What seems to be taken for granted are the effects that this ability will have on the evolution of our consciousness over time. Major breakthroughs in technological invention have always been preceded by major transformations in human thought. We can contrast a similar transformation with the advent of the printing press, which deeply altered the way we viewed, shared, and thought of language and information. Technology is neutral. Fire can be used to illuminate a room where a lively discussion spans long into the night. Fire can also be used to burn and destroy anything in its wake. Like fire, the internet is a technology which must be wielded with care. The same global network that can unite disparate people can also be wielded for collective manipulation and control. Seeding mass hysteria, constructing false narratives about reality, reinforcing hive minds and echo chambers, and being used for mass surveillance. The internet amplifies archetypal energies, positive or negative, tribalism, perversion, and hero or villain myth-making, for example. Typically, algorithms select more for things that appeal to our lower nature, meaning that it is entirely up to us whether we wield this technology for good or ill. History is full of examples of nightmarish horror stories that resulted from efforts to diminish the individuality of people and mold them into a group of interchangeable units for control. This is the shadow side of collectivism. Today, the opposite seems to be happening, where everyone is becoming so hyper-individualized and divided that the chances of people uniting under a common purpose or goal become smaller and smaller. Obviously, a balance between collective conformity and individual fragmentation has to be found. For the purposes of this video, however, I'll end this chapter with some words from Christ. Quote, "Every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand." For Teilhard de Chardin, the noosphere is only the most recent development in a process which is not only planetary in size, but cosmic. In order to explain why the universe seems to be driven toward more and more complexity, Chardin believed that there was something in the deep future, at the end of time, which was pulling everything towards it. This is, of course, the omega point, a teleological attractor of infinite complexity, in which everything that has ever been or will come to be incorporated and saved eternally in the indefinitely complexifying totality of the omega point. In Chardin's view, he equated the omega point with the figure of Christ, the cosmic Christ, in which everything that has ever been lost throughout the entire course of history will eventually come to be renewed and redeemed. The omega point is what the psychonaut philosopher Terence McKenna famously called the transcendental object at the end of history.
And then there was spaceflight, global cultures, cybernetic networks, DNA sequencing, and what is the question? The technosphere, the biosphere, the cultural sphere, which Teilhard de Chardin called the Noosphere, is in a state of forced self-transformation. We are all in the grip of a transformative attractor, an attractor which over very long periods of time produced stable biosystems, oceans and jungles full of life. Over a very short period of time, thousands of years, has produced human civilizations, art movements, dynastic families, languages, migrations.
However, unlike Chardin, McKenna was quite vocal about his disdain for Orthodox Christianity and did not see the omega point to have any traditionally theological significance. But the two ideas still share a common essence, in that they describe a universe which is fundamentally driven towards an ultimate purpose. McKenna would build upon Teilhard's concept by suggesting that the transcendental object at the end of history sends ripples and shockwaves back in time, and that these manifest as critical events in our history, such as the appearance of Christ, major catastrophes, cataclysms, and civilizations collapsing, wars, riots, protests, and assassinations, the growing interest in religious and scientific apocalypticism, and other major cultural events. It has been nearly a century since Chardin wrote The Phenomenon of Man. Even during his time, he lived through a tumultuous period in human history, living through 2 world wars, witnessing multiple paradigm-shifting breakthroughs in science, seeing the rise of industry, machines, and even the earliest computers at the end of his life. To say that the zeitgeist of his era was one of a critical turning point in human history would be an understatement. Yet it seems as though that feeling of being right at the edge of history, where something absolutely unprecedented could happen any day, the feeling of sitting at the peak of an exponential curve, hasn't ever left us. Throughout every age, we've always thought ourselves to be at a turning point in history, and in many ways we have, since it is an ascending spiral of complexity. The fact that things seem to be getting so crazy and absurd the more time goes on is exactly what one would expect in a world of increasing complexity, consciousness, and freedom. As a species still awakening to the reality and world we inhabit and the minds and bodies we have, most of the absurdity that occurs on the daily is in some sense perfectly understandable. If we zoom out, however, I think that we can see that a larger trend that accompanies the intensification of consciousness is the intensification of beauty. It seems like from the beginning, the universe has complexified in order to intensify its beauty. However, without anything to be in contrast with it, beauty would have no meaning. If there was only a single harmonious monotone, or a radiant beam of pure golden light, without anything to contrast it with, it wouldn't be that beautiful. It would just be. The intensification of beauty and goodness requires the intensification of dissonance, ugliness, absurdity, and indeed pain. What makes something beautiful is the drama, the darkness contrasted with the light. That's why our favorite songs aren't just a single monotone chord. but rather a complex sequence of notes and tones that tell a story, evoking memories and emotions. The greatest works of music and art are so often products of minds and lives that have endured immense pain and suffering as well. In my view, all of this seems to speak to the idea of universal truths being mirrored and fractalized within our own lives. In more technical terms, the macrocosm and microcosm correspondence. The Phenomenon of Man is one of those books that needs to be read more than once. Spanning from Alpha unto Omega, the book is truly titanic in scope. Throughout my own time studying Chardin's life and ideas, I found myself truly captivated by a thinker whose breadth and depth is among the very rare few. We face ourselves with truly ultimate questions when thinking with Chardin. From the origin of life, the nature of reality, the history of the earth, and all the forms that have come and gone, and to the question of what the meaning of it all is, what our place is in this grand story. Obviously, there is so much more that could be said with so many threads left unfinished, but to explore any part of life is always to leave an infinity untouched. Thanks for watching. Till next time, stay curious. Peace.